Welcome out to the War in Heaven. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are talking today about principles of creation. This, we believe, is actually quite important to understand what's at stake in the War in Heaven. Again, we look at the War in Heaven as being something that actually happened and is still happening. We believe that Satan, which is kind of the representation of evil and also an actual person, is at war with God. We believe that God is good. And we'll get into more of those principles and more of those things, talking about God and existence and Satan or the devil and different things. But at its core, the war in heaven is a fight over life, over creation. There would have been no war if there had been no creation. And so it's important to take a step back from this whole war and say, wait, why is there good and bad? Because certainly I know it's common for people to criticize God, to say, well, if God's good, why is there bad? Why do these things exist? And from our perspective, they're good questions to ask because it helps explore the nature of creation. Can good exist without bad? Is one of the fundamental questions that's kind of, you could say, plagued the human mind and heart for many years, probably for millennia. So to kind of give an idea, just a simple basic idea real quick of a concept of creation. If you look at something such as my hand or this flag behind me, you could say my hand exists. Now, there's some people that might argue with that, but I think most people say, yeah, your hand exists, Austin, it's there, or that flag exists, it's there. It has shape, it has form. It really is. Now, in order for my hand to exist, though, one of the fundamental truths or propositions or principles, whatever you want to call it, that we believe in is that when something exists, when it is, there has to be something that is not that as well. So if you want to create a hand, let's say there was nothing else in existence and you just wanted to create a hand or a finger, the finger of God that people talk about. If you're going to create that finger, then two things have to come into existence: the finger and something that's not the finger. If the finger is just everything that exists, then there's no finger. You have to give it a definition. You have to say, this is the end of it, and everything else outside of this is not that. And so we're talking, in essence, about this matter of definitions, this matter of saying, to create, you have to give something shape, you have to give it a boundary, you have to give it a form. And to do that, you have to put a stop between what is and what isn't. And this is a concept that I believe is actually fundamentally critical to understanding a lot of what's even taking place in our society today. We'll tie this in a little bit more, but we're talking in our society about, can a man become a woman or a woman become a man? We have had a big debate. Can gay people be married or not? We get into a lot of these principles and these discussions, and it's interesting to see right now how much we're at war in our society with definitions. And we ask, why are definitions so important? Why are we arguing over what a woman is, what a man is, what marriage is? Why do we argue over these things? And why are we working so hard to change definitions? Or fighting so hard to keep them the same? What's at stake in it? And I believe that to understand what's at stake, we have to understand these principles of creation, to say creation actually starts with words, with the words that give it rules, that give it shape, that give it form. And we find this embodied in our laws today. Almost every law has a definition section where they go through and define things. And ultimately, you can change the whole applicability of a law by just changing a simple definition, because a term is defined, it gets used in the law, And if you update that term to say, oh, instead of this applying to corporations that are 50 employees or more, it now applies to corporations that are 5 employees or more, you don't have to change anything else in the law. It just now suddenly that little definition was changed and the law becomes applicable to a whole new class of people. So to me, this is just kind of I guess a really quick way to explain a little bit of what we're going to talk about. But we want to jump into this notion that creation takes on at least two things, what is and what isn't. And to create something to give it form, I don't believe it's possible to create something that is without creating something that isn't as well at the same time. I believe the two always go together. And I think we recognize this somewhat. When we look at things with our eyes, we know, oh, yep, that's Austin. Oh, that's Michael. They're not the same. One is Austin, one isn't Austin. But to really carry that through and think through it, to say, if good is to exist, then there has to be something that isn't good, or else good wouldn't have any shape, it wouldn't have a form, it wouldn't have a meaning, it wouldn't have a definition, unless there's something it's not. And when we talk about what it's not, that's where we start to talk about bad. Michael, curious if you want to share some of your thoughts on creation and these principles of what is, what isn't, your way to describe that, or go through some of that as well.
Yeah, to go back to what you're talking about with society, we are, in a sense, playing a game of creation when we talk about definitions. When we talk to each other, we use words that we believe that the other person will understand so that we can express our thoughts, our ideas. And if we start to change those, there's hesitation to do that on some points and willingness to do it on other points because we're worried about what we are creating or what we are destroying based on how we are now defining different things. And we may say there are better ways to express something, to define something. And then there are worse ways to do so. You can be too general, you can be so specific it doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of the battle we fight. And people have realized that if we can change definitions and we can create, we can participate in creation to some degree of something new. I don't know that any of us really has an idea of what that will look like. We believe perhaps that we're creating something new and something better. But the danger of changing the definitions is we're changing what's been created, what's worked, what's been understood. And so probably something we should look at as we're doing that is if we're changing a definition, is it becoming more definite or less definite? The less definite something becomes, the more it becomes destroyed. If your hand was initially defined as what we see typically there on a human, and then we start to expand it to things that look like feet, and then things that look like knees, and then heads, then whole bodies, is there a hand anymore? We've just destroyed a hand. And so as we change definitions, we ought to be careful to say, this is more definite, this is more accurate, versus this is just destroying what we understood. This is participating in the creation or destruction process. And it's interesting to see how that battle wages today. Take a look at any law or legal suit and just read the paragraph after paragraph of legal jargon, for lack of a better term, as they're just trying to do their best, in some cases to obfuscate detail, but in other cases just to try to be as specific as they can. We have taken words and meanings and we have looked at them in 100,000 different ways. It's hard to communicate something definite because of our continued insistence to changing definition, trying something new. It can be very difficult to speak plainly and simply. And that's just a battle we see fighting out every day in the political sphere, in society. You may say something to somebody not intending any kind of harm or injury, and their understanding of all those words, they've decided has brought them harm and injury. And then we have disagreements about not the good and the bad, but the nature of the words themselves. And so it's something we see play out every day. And it's interesting as we look back to creation and the war in heaven, that this creation was started by God speaking and creating the world. And so the words we use and the definitions we use play a large part to the way we understand the world and the way we understand creation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I just want to show an example. If you're watching on YouTube, we have this. This is just pulling up Utah code really quick. Title 13, Chapter 11, Utah Consumer Sales Practices Act. And this is the way that most laws are. You get here and it starts out Section 1, talks about either the title to the act or the citation of the act. Section 2 isn't always there, but this one talks about the purpose of the act. They're trying to give some intent to this. So some will have that, some won't. But almost always they'll then have this definition section. And you click into it, and they have a list of terms. So they'll say charitable solicitation, and then they'll go through and define what a charitable solicitation means. The consumer transaction, they'll say what it is. Sometimes they'll say, here it says it includes these things, but sometimes they'll say it excludes. It's not part of the definition. It's not covered by this law. And it goes through, even defines person. What does a person mean in the law, or supplier? And if the law goes through and changes person to mean something it didn't before, then suddenly that new thing is covered by this law. This law now has application to it. And there's certainly a lot of power in these definitions. The definitions usually define the scope of how far this law reaches, how far it applies, how far something's happening. And I think that it's interesting because Mike, you talked some about we start to destroy the concept of hand, for example. If we just define hand as being a knee too and a foot too and whatever else. Now, does my verbal definition change the fact that I actually have a hand? No. So there's this consistent argument and tension in society that, well, regardless of what we call it, truth is still truth, and we're not going to change that. So you can call my hand whatever you want it to. You can call my knee a hand if you want. It doesn't change the fact I have a hand and a knee. But what we're talking about, I think, is we're talking about there are some things that are just physical in nature. My hand, for example, is just physical in nature. I didn't create that. But when we talk about things that we were given jurisdiction to create and we were given jurisdiction over, and we talk about definitions, we are actually in the process of creating or destroying, fortifying or weakening certain things. And in the war in heaven, when a big part of this war, I believe, was Satan attacking things that God had created. He didn't like the definitions to them. He didn't like the bounds around them. He didn't like the fact that, well, certain people may be excluded if they don't make certain choices. He said, Satan's thing was, I want salvation for everyone. That's what we believe is a central part of the war in heaven, is that Satan wanted to save everybody and provide salvation for everyone. And if salvation was available to everybody, then in some ways salvation stopped existing. There was no saving anymore. There's no opting in. It's just something that is, and it's applicable to every single person. And that changed the definition of what it was with God's plan, with what it was that God had created in the sense of salvation. Now, that may beg the question for some, whether there's justice in a plan that not everyone, chose to participate or chooses to join in this definition of things. And just to provide a quick asterisk there, I fully believe that God's plan is one that people could opt into if they want to. But but he provided other things that people could opt into as well. And that this notion of saying salvation is a thing, you have to choose to abide by it or live by it. It wasn't to say that you can't, that it only, fits 10 people. It's just to say that it is meaningful because there is another option. And for Satan, when he says, well, let's just save everyone, the only way to do that would be to change the definition of save from what God had created. And when you change that definition of save, you're changing the very essence of what that thing is, the very meaning of it. And that changes the fundamental characteristic of salvation itself. And so in this battle today, and one of the principles we believe is that the war in heaven continues on the earth today. We're still battling these things. And so it's been fascinating to me to watch this debate rage in society about, can a man be a woman? And we see it playing out in sports. We see these women getting stripped of their world records because there's a man competing, someone that claims they're now a woman, and saying, well, I'm faster, I can swim faster, I can run faster, whatever it is. And they're taking titles away, world titles and different things. And so there's this fierce debate. A lot of women are saying, hey, this isn't fair. And a lot of people are saying, hey, well, why not? He says he's a woman. And it's this fascinating process because, again, I didn't create men and women. And there is some truth to the notion that society has roles for men and women that have been created by society. But there's this deeper question of, is there actually a kind of eternal or truth-based definition to what a man and a woman is? And if so, if something exists, if a woman's to exist, there has to be something that's not a woman. And so we have the man, we have these two things. And again, there's this minimum of two things that have to exist. It doesn't mean there can't be more, because I can be me, and then there can be millions of other people that are themselves. But at a minimum, if something's to exist, there has to be something else too that's not it. And so in our society, when we start to say, well, Austin, you can be a woman if you want, just based on the way you feel, then suddenly we have radically changed the definition of woman to include a lot more things. And as we do that, to Michael's point, we are changing the notion from a societal perspective of what a woman is or isn't. Are we actually changing what God set it up to be or what truth set it up to be? No. But we are changing in our domain that definition. And when we change that definition and make it more expansive, the more expansive a definition becomes, the less meaningful it becomes. It actually starts to lose meaning, because the more and more and more you have of something, the less it has bounds to it, the less it has creation to it. And so if I can just say I'm a woman, then that by its very nature now means, oh, the woman definition in our eyes starts to lose its value. It starts to lose its the meaning or the identity associated with it. And I believe that as we do that, as we move away from things into areas that aren't true, we start to have a very strong loss of identity that follows. We have a strong loss of purpose. We start to lose touch with truths that may otherwise govern our existence and help us operate and function. And so in this realm, to dive a little bit deeper into the creation side, if we just go simply and say, well, why does bad exist? If God's good, why does bad exist? And I look at it and say, well, if God wanted to create love, and you look at it and you give love bounds, you say, okay, this is what love is. But then there has to be something that's either law or truth or whatever people want to say that says this is what love isn't. Because for love to be its complete separate thing, kind of like my hand to be something separate, there has to be things that aren't that as well. And so in the creation process, I believe strongly that God used words. We read in the Bible that God spoke. That's the basis of creation. He speaks and he's giving bounds to things, shape. And everything in order to create then is almost discriminatory or exclusionary in some way, and that not everything can be that by nature. And so not everything is love. Not everything is good. There has to be things that aren't. And the interesting thing about that is the scriptures talk about the way to heaven or truth or good, and it says straight is the gate, narrow is the way that leads to life. It says, and few there be that find it. And I've always, when I read that, I've always thought, so why is it narrow? Why is it talk about few there be that find it? And I don't believe that's saying that there's only a few people that are saved. I believe, though, that what it's saying is truth, or the things that are, there can be few of those, but as a result, the untruths are kind of, there's a lot more of those in nature. If you have something that's Austin, I can have a billion things that aren't me, but only one thing that's me. And that makes it so that if you're looking for what Austin is, that's a very narrow thing in the subset of all human existence. And I think that in life, on our journey here, we come across so many untruths. We come across so many things that aren't true, that it makes it so that truths are narrow. They're a small part of our existence here on this earth anyways. And we're trying to find ways to incorporate more truth into that. But again, it goes back to one of the great important pieces of the War in Heaven. We need to be very diligent about finding truth, because the number of untruths that can exist, I believe, greatly exceed the number of truths that can exist. Michael, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one thing you hit on earlier ties into that, where you mentioned our identity and having an identity. There was an author, Brandon Mull, wrote a book. Trying to remember the name, The Five Kingdoms, Sky Raiders. They had a character. This is a fantasy story. Had a character that could mold and turn into look like anything they wanted to look like. And the character was having a conversation with one of the main characters of the story and describing how they were struggling to find out who they were. And the main character said, well, if you think about it, looking any way you want is the opposite of having an identity. If you can just be anything, then you're kind of nothing at that point, if you can be everything. And the point is that the truth is defined as something, and then the things that are not that make that something exist. If you can be anything, you are nothing. You don't have an identity. The fact that you are limited in scope to being Austin, or I'm limited in scope to being Michael, makes me Michael. And so when we talk about there being things like love and good and peace, they have to be defined as such. They can't be all things. All things can't be love. All things can't be good. All things can't be peace. There has to be some sort of complementary but opposite essence of something. C.S. Lewis talked about that. He's mentioned that was one of the things that turned him to God. Was as an atheist, he decried a lot of the suffering he saw as being evidence of there being no God. And then he asked himself the question, but why does that make me upset? Why am I looking for not suffering? Why am I looking for not bad? Why am I looking for good? Why would I think that that exists? And it's because suffering exists, then not suffering exists. Bad exists, then not bad exists. What, or else what are you basing it on? Suffering is not suffering if there is no lack of suffering. Bad is not bad if there is no good. And so just by the mere existence of the suffering and the bad tells you, as you pointed out before, that there has to be something complementary in opposition to it, the good, beautiful, the lovely, all those kinds of things. And that's part of creation. So the evidence of the good is the bad. The evidence of the bad is the good. They complement each other in that respect.
Yeah, and I think, at least my religion talks about this, as they kind of define it as the law of opposition, saying there's opposition in all things. There's these complementary states that exist. And I believe it's this very fascinating foundational principle of existence itself, to your point, Michael, of, well, if I could be everything, then I'm nothing. And the very fact that I am limited to what I have in here, and I have weaknesses and I have strengths, that defines me. And now, do I forever have to be, is it to say that I can't ever develop new strengths or weaknesses, whatever? No, again, that's a whole nother kind of topic in this discussion. But it's more to say, I should be grateful that I can't do everything, because that actually gives me meaning. It gives me purpose. It gives me identity. And God, in his infinite wisdom, I believe, created each of us. At least, currently we have some limitation in place, in that, well, I can't be Michael. And that's a blessing, because then I have meaning. I have purpose as a being that can't be something else, and they can't be me. There's bounds set in place. And one of the fascinating things about truth is that truth has bounds to it, and these bounds don't contradict. Truth is truth because it's consistent. It weaves together. It creates proper bounds to things. If you look at our world, it's amazing to look at the boundaries that exist in nature. You have a tree, it grows in dirt that sits by a stream, but we can look at each of those things and clearly delineate water, dirt, tree, leaves, sun. Every one of them has their bounds to it. They have their place. They have what they are, but they also have what they aren't. And I can go through a list, miles long about what I'm not, because there's millions of options for what I'm not. But again, that comprehensive list, and so we can look at that sometimes, we can get down on ourselves, we can get depressed and say all these things we're not, or we can recognize, well, the fact that I'm not something means, by nature, I am something as well. I have value, I have purpose for something. And this war, again, if we truly appreciate what it is, the war in heaven is really a battle over the very nature of existence itself. Satan, I believe, wanted to completely rewrite the rules of existence. He wanted to have an existence where we all are saved. There's no agency. And this form of existence was one that denies us of something that we call life itself. God, when he gave us the gift of life, said, there's something amazing here. It takes work, it takes effort, there's risk, there's reward, there's pain, there's all kinds of things along the way, but there's something called life. And in order for life to exist, then there's something called death. There's the opposite of it. These two things always go hand in hand. And even from an eternal perspective, when we look at salvation, when we look at heaven and hell, they're representations of eternal life versus eternal death. And death is one of those terms that we have to put a little asterisk by, same with life, and define, because spiritual death is defined as separation from God. Eternal life is living with God. And there's this notion that God is this life giver. And again, we can create a robot that does something. And to some that may be alive, to some it may not. But the way I like to see it is, I believe Satan was very much pushing for more of an existence where we were similar to robots. God was creating an existence where we had agency, where we had this deeper meaning to life. We had something to experience, purpose, drive, all these different things. But that only comes through things that aren't that as well. And so we come to this earth, we experience life here, but we also experience death. And we have to experience both in order to have a true appreciation for what it is that God's given us. And so we will experience deep heartache and sorrow and suffering with death. But we're trying to understand and realize that because there's that heartache and sorrow, there's something glorious and amazing as well associated with true life and what that is. And so we can start to realize that when we experience things in life and when we experience a void, when we experience something missing, we can start to understand, well, that means there is something that exists. There's something there. And this is something I think that's been hitting home for me somewhat. I look at the political nature of America today. I don't feel like I have a place in the main parties that exist, even in the third parties that exist. I look at them, I don't find an identity, I don't find a connection that really resonates with what I feel inside. And as I thought about this, and I thought, I feel a void. I feel that there's something missing here. The more I feel it and experience it, the more I start to believe, well, there's something actually better that exists. There's something better than the two parties that exist. There's something better politically. We can do better. We can achieve. We can push for something better. And as I look at the system of capitalism, free market, people experience some kind of void. They see a need. And because of that, they know there's this principle of creation that kicks in their mind that says, oh, if I can solve that problem, there'll be a demand for it. People will want it. And I believe that the free market shows very readily this principle of creation to say, I experience something that isn't, and therefore I can create something that is. I can take that what isn't and turn it into something that is, that has value, that has meaning. But again, it has shape, it has form. The law respects that here. It says, yep, that's your patent, or that's your copyright, or that's your trademark. And we create bounds to things. We create these rules. We create this system where the creator gets to then exercise the rights of ownership and make the rules for things. And these are all domains that on a very small scale are similar, I think, to what God's doing. He's the creator. There's rules, there's laws, there's things in force. And we then get to accept, well, do we want this life or not? Do we want what God's offering or not? If we don't, there's an alternative. Satan's offered an alternative. And God doesn't force us to take his way. It's one of the fascinating things about his way. And again, we'll tie into agency and what that is. We'll talk about that a lot more in depth in other episodes. But this is a notion that creation means bounds. Creation means there is something that is and something that isn't. And that something that isn't will be opposite in nature to that which is. And that's what gives meaning. That's what gives the ability to experience that. But that's what gives the ability to have form or shape. You know, I like to imagine, it was probably never this way, but I like to imagine just a big open thing of space, kind of this vast stretch of space, nothing in it. And I just kind of envision just kind of a grayish or blackish expanse. And then if you say, all right, well, I want to take and make an American flag in here, and suddenly there's an American flag in there. Well, that flag still has the bounds. It still has the shape. And then there's just this expanse still of what's not the flag. And definitionally, again, I think we underestimate the power of words quite often. But the power of words is if we can speak truth, then we can create. It's this real principle that when you can speak truth, when you can give it, because even just speaking, what that does is it takes a concept and it gives it some bounds. It's clothing it with something. It's putting it in a sphere in which there's meaning. And that's the very beginning process of creation, is to speak truth and to then start to work from there, to build, to create, to shape, to continue to refine. But in that process, we have to remember that meaning comes when we can exclude things from it. And so we have this fascinating tension in our society of equality for everyone, include everyone in everything. So if there's a man that wants to be a woman, well, let's include him. Let's let him be a woman. And I think we have to look at that from a deeper principle of, well, wait, what does that actually do to us as a society if we radically expand the concept of what it means to be a woman? We start to lose the very identity and nature of what it means to be a woman. And if we lose that, do we also lose the purpose, the power, the meaning that comes from being a woman? And it's fascinating to look at correlations to things. Again, this is statistics, so it shows correlation. Statistics aren't great at showing causation. But right now, the number of teen girls that are seriously depressed or contemplating suicide is very high. The numbers are quite depressing, honestly, to see. I've seen some that talk about 1 in 3 girls have considered suicide or different things. And I believe that people become desperate to find meaning in who they are, what they are. And if we, as a society, just expand this notion out and say, oh, well, yeah, you're this, but that means anything, anyone can be it. And there's no meaning or value to it. And we start to lose that as a society. Now, is the change in definitions the sole reason why there may be, girls struggling with identity? No. But I do believe there's a connection there. And I do believe it can't be blind to the fact that as a society, we have a duty, I believe, to stand up for and pursue truth-based definitions. Because truth brings life. It's inseparably connected to life. And non-truth, I believe, is inseparably connected to the opposite of life. And we're talking from a spiritual perspective. That the things that we do, the definitions we create and live by and pursue and accept, start to radically define and impact what we can experience spiritually here. And our spiritual being is the one that suffers or benefits from our ability to properly pursue and embrace truth. Michael, do you have any thoughts or comments on any of that or other topics?
Yeah, to follow up with that, if we think about the creation, when we talk about God creating the world, Him speaking it into an existence, He's speaking truth, creating things from His truthful words. And so the opposite of that would be to speak lies and be destructive. And so to bring it back to the point of our society today, there's a desperation out there to redefine words, terms, but we need to be very careful. Are we speaking truth and creating? Or are we speaking falsehoods and destroying? We need to be, as you pointed out, be okay with the exclusionary principle of truth. If something is to be, there has to be something that is not. That isn't to say that some people think, well, that's leaving somebody out from the best things in the world. I don't believe that anybody has to be excluded from salvation, living with God, but they can't make whatever choice they want to get to that point. Else, as you pointed out, there's no meaning to salvation. So we say, hey, everybody needs to be included in such and such a thing because somebody may feel bad otherwise. Well, if everybody's included, then that thing isn't really something. There has to be an exclusionary principle in order for it to exist. We can create things that involve everybody and allow everybody to be happy, such as freedom, as we're trying to create in this country. It's something that can be applied to everybody, but it requires that us as individuals in this country live a certain way. We have to live according to principles that foster liberty. We can't make whatever choices we want and still continue to have liberty and freedom. We have to make choices that are commensurate with the concept of freedom and liberty. That's the only way to maintain it. And so it's exclusive in that it's something that is true and exists, but it can be inclusive to everybody as long as they make choices that are in harmony with what it actually is. So it doesn't need to leave anybody out if we're talking about freedom or something like that. But it can if somebody doesn't make choices that are in harmony with the idea of freedom. And so as we fight these battles today about definitions, we seem to be wanting to create a world that doesn't, it's more not truthful than truthful, and it doesn't really exist. And so as we seek to change definitions of things such as men and women, we start destroying what we had and not creating something better and more productive. And so it's incumbent on us to preserve liberty, to preserve freedom, to preserve good and truth, to speak truthful words, to watch what we say, to make sure we are not destroying, but we're creating.
Yeah, and I think, some of the images that came to mind, I was thinking about the Super Bowl, NFL Super Bowl, or the Olympics. Why do those have any meaning to them? It's because they're incredibly exclusive. If we just said, oh, everyone in the world gets a gold medal, good job. There's no meaning to that gold medal at that point. And this is again going to kind of the spiritual level to say, well, how can you experience fulfillment? How can you experience satisfaction? How can you experience reward? Well, it has to be in something that you worked for, that you chose to pursue, that you sacrificed for, that you got up early to go exercise or whatever. But it's something that, at least from, again, this world perspective, we can understand that there's a big difference between the participation trophy that every kid gets when they play soccer and the NFL or the World Cup or the Olympics. Those gold medals come because they are exclusionary and they have intense meaning because of how exclusionary they are. Now, again, that doesn't mean that, to your point, that liberty can't be given to all, because liberty can, and it can still be meaningful. Because by nature, it requires that we live a certain way, that we take responsibility for ourselves, that we do a bunch of things. But it also has an opposite to it. Liberty has things that aren't liberty. And so we can experience those as well. We can experience kind of the misery of living that way. If you live with someone telling you everything you have to do, you will never feel satisfaction in life, because if you get the gold medal, but someone made you do it every day with a gun at your head, then you were forced to do it. You don't have the satisfaction of having chosen that, having pursued it. And so truth, kind of like gravity can apply in all situations. But it still is, by nature, by the way it's created and the bounds it has, it gives us the ability to choose how we interact with it. And everything that's been created that's truthful gives us this ability to choose how to interact. This is where the basis of agency starts to form, is that everything has a bound to it. I'm actually separate and distinct from the force of gravity. The force of gravity can act on me, but it's not me. And I can actually go into space and not be subject to gravity, or I can jump, or I can create a machine that flies. I can do different things because gravity's not me. It's independent of me. And that independence in nature is also, I believe, a key to understanding where truth exists. All truth is independent in its own sphere that it gets placed in. Everything that has life that's based on truth is independent. It has its own sphere, it has its own bounds, and it doesn't contradict because it's given its bounds. It's created and it says, okay, this is your bound, this is your bound, this is your bound. Now, again, as a human, every other human is subject to technically interacting with me. If I flew around the world and I had all the time I wanted and met everyone, or I post things online, that's something that I'm now exerting a force that potentially, could be subject to all the people on the planet, similar to gravity. But it doesn't mean I am those people. And it doesn't mean I can take away their thoughts and their agency because they're independent of me. And so just because a force can work on someone or something, or liberty can be available to as a force to all people, it doesn't take away its inherent nature. It's more when we say the thing that takes away its nature, its goodness, is when we start to say it's more than its bounds and its truth allow it to be. That's when it loses its identity. So if we say a woman is now just whatever creature wants to be a woman, then that notion of being a woman, that identity, is now lost. The more expansive we create that outside, or take that outside of its normal bounds, the more we lose it. And so, to me, these are still fascinating principles to me to talk through. I don't know, how well they come through on a podcast without a lot of visuals associated with it. But we certainly hope that we're giving a slight taste to this notion that existence, creation, requires something that is and something that isn't. It requires some level of opposition. And that opposition, again, can look different based on the thing at work, or what it is, or the life, or the shape it was given, the form. But ultimately, it's what creates value. And one of the things I believe so strongly about the whole war in heaven concept is that I believe that each of us are based on and created from a principle of truth. And that because of that, I actually don't believe that there's this notion that, oh, Austin didn't work out, let's just create another one of him. Let's just create another one of him until we get, and we'll just be happy because we can clone Austin, and there's no value to Austin. I think the whole nature of the war in heaven, the whole nature of Christ coming to this earth, of atoning for us to save us, is that we're actually fundamentally, inherently, and eternally unique. There's only one of us. And because there's only one of us, we have value. Intense value. No one else can take my place. No one else can fill in for me. No clone, no whatever. Because there's something in me that's eternal. Something in me that's just me. There's nothing else in existence that is this. And so then I have value. I have identity. And to God, he then has a plan that says you are valuable and you are loved. And I want to provide a path where you can choose to come and enjoy these neat things. And so God came, suffered, did these things because we are of value. We're not just this, oh, no, that robot didn't work out, I'll just make another one. There's something truly, fundamentally eternal and individual in us. And I believe that's one of the very principles that is evidenced by these notions of the war in heaven, notions of the gospel. It's fundamentally premised on this fact that we're irreplaceable and where we're valuable because there's not just this other Austin that comes into being, like, oh, this one didn't work out, let's just do another one. And we see that with death. Nobody ever replaces someone you've lost. Nobody ever replaces even the animal you lost. That animal will always be unique. That human will always be unique. And we continue to live. The sense of loss, though, I think is a testament to the fact that there's still life somewhere. Just because that eternal thing isn't with us, that life is still somewhere. So to me, these are some of the principles, some of the things. And again, there's a lot at play here, so we'll continue trying to unpack it. But Michael, do you have any final thoughts for us before we wrap up for the day?
No. Your final thoughts on being unique and how important that is to truth, definition, and our understanding of our importance of this life. If there to create, if there has to be something and something that is not, then yeah, if you are you, then there has to be not you. And that means that you are unique and you are important and you have something unique to you. You probably you can create. And so we should probably look towards that as a goal, not destruction, but creation. What can we, as our unique individuals, what can we create to continue to further truth and our understanding of truth?
Yeah. So thanks for joining us today. We hope that you can take some time this week to reflect on what is it that truly gives a definition to something. And it's, from our perspective, it's this notion of balance, of rules or principles, of limiting things to say, this is the extent to what it is. And the more narrow that becomes, the more valuable it becomes, is one of the takeaways. So because there's only one of me, it's more valuable at this point. And if there's only one Super Bowl, it's more valuable than if everyone gets a Super Bowl trophy. And so again, Satan in his war said, well, everyone should have a Super Bowl. Everyone should be all the same, all these things. And when he was doing that, he was taking away bounds. When God had created something and put bounds to it, Satan said, I don't like that because I'm not that. I'd like to be that, or whatever it was. And again, we see that playing out in our society today, and we'll try and follow up more on the gender debate and these other debates. But it's important to recognize definitions are the very foundation of creation. And when there's a force at work to want to change a definition, we have to be very, I believe, cognizant and aware of the fact that someone out there knows what that change will entail. They've mapped it out for how it will play out in society. Maybe it will be good, maybe it will be bad. Somebody knows, but have we taken the time to map out, do we really want to change this definition? What comes from it as we either expand it or restrict it? And most of what we see taking place in society is trying to expand definitions, which from our perspective is likely leading to a loss of purpose and identity around those. So thanks so much for joining us today on this War in Heaven podcast, and we will follow up more in future episodes and go through more of these principles.